All right, I think we can get started. If you can settle down. Good afternoon, everybody, and good day for those who are joining us online. It's a beautiful day in Ithaca. I hope we have a few more of this kind of good day. It's really a distinct honor and pleasure to introduce today a colleague from our very own campus, Professor Chris Barrett. In a way, it's a man who needs no introduction. And I was battling with how I introduce Professor Chris Barrett. So I'm just learning, he came to Cornell University in 1998. I took his class in 1999. I think that's before some of you were born, right? And ended up being on my PhD committee. And he's been at Cornell, where he's right now the Stephen B. and Janet C. Ashley Professor of Applied Economics and Management in the Dyson School. Professor Chris Barrett, you will all read his bio, so I will not really read and repeat most of the information that we have there. It could take half of this seminar, by the way. He's an amazing scholar. He's published 21 books, about 280 journal articles, 103 book chapters, and collectively he's got more than 63,000 citations, which makes him one of the top leading scholars in this particular field. When you look at ag-econ, development economics, food security issues, and poverty, he's one of the eminent scholars in this discipline globally. So we are really lucky to hear him speak to us today. His work has impacted many, especially those in the global south. And I think above all, what I wanted to emphasize, and Chris, I will embarrass you a little bit here, I think he does this because he cares about the subjects and issues that he works on. This is not just work for Chris. He really deeply cares about the issues that he does his research on. Beyond being an amazing academic, he's just an amazing development person and somebody who has really impacted many lives, mentored many scholars in this field, including myself. And so it's such a pleasure, Chris Barrett, to hear you speak and share your remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you for the overly generous introduction, Ed. It's a pleasure to be back talking before this seminar. I was trying to figure out when I last actually spoke to this seminar, and if my records are right, it was about 16 years ago. So I think we're cycling back through. Please interrupt with questions or comments as we go. I know we've reserved the last 10 minutes for that, but I'm very happy. In fact, if there are questions of clarification, I far prefer you ask me when we're stuck and you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, than that you wait until much later on. Let's clear up any uncertainty as we go. So I'm going to talk today about something a number of us are thinking a lot about these days, which is how to take advantage of the fact that there are data becoming available at much higher frequency, by which I mean we talk to people, we ask people questions, or we observe something about them relatively frequently. Relative frequency here being like more than once every several years. In fact, I'll show you a very disturbing slide on survey revisit frequency in a few minutes. There's a lot of thinking going into how do we use data, how do we collect data, what are we using it for? Because data collection is expensive. And what I've been trying to do for quite a few years now is convince those who finance data collection that there's a really high return to going back to the same people frequently. And not just over periods of their lifetime, which has high value, but going back to them frequently even during the year. So I'm going to talk about harnessing what I'll call high frequency data, and in particular high frequency longitudinal data, meaning visiting the same person over time, or the same household, or the same firm. Longitudinal meaning we observe the same unit over time, not just we're going and collecting data frequently. So I'm going to talk about its value for development and humanitarian purposes. And I think the place to start is just why do we collect data at all? Governments and various development agencies, humanitarian agencies, invest a lot in data collection because they need to be able to describe the world as it is and predict where things are going to be at some point in the future, depending upon what the planning horizon is. We researchers often think the purpose of data is for inference, to test hypotheses. What's the effect of intervention X, or how much growth, economic growth, was caused by the following thing? Those are inferential questions. Those are research questions. They are important for policy, but the fundamental foundational data of policymaking is descriptive. Just understanding what are current conditions, and it's predictive. What are likely future conditions? So the task of statistically representative observational data. Observational meaning we observe it, it's not part of an experiment. Statistically representative meaning we're trying to get something that is manageable to field, but can describe a broader population. So the purpose of statistically representative survey data, observational data, is largely description and prediction. But we can use it for inference, and we can do a lot more with it, especially when it's high frequency. As I said, I've been making this case for quite a long time. In 2010, after the 2008-2009 global food price crisis, which most of you don't remember because you were way too young, but there was this real catastrophe in 2008-2009. Multiple governments were overthrown in food price riots around the world. So Madagascar right now is in crisis. Its government was overthrown in January 2009 after people took to the streets because of high food prices and the investment that induced, taking a huge parcel of land in Madagascar and leasing it off to a foreign corporation, Daewoo, the Korean conglomerate. After this food price crisis, there was lots of concern about food security. So the journal Science dedicated an issue to food security themes. And I had a piece in that where I wrote the quote you see there: to direct scarce resources to where they can do the greatest good, actions must be guided by reliable information. Measurement drives diagnosis and response. And part of what I was trying to make the case for was high frequency data. I failed. So it took a long time to get people to start investing in this. Far more influential was Angus Deaton, a Nobel laureate in economics. Angus was really the intellectual engine behind what is now known as the Living Standards Measurement Surveys, LSMS. The statistically representative surveys the World Bank coordinates across the global south that provide its measures of poverty. So when you see some headline measure of X number of people live on less than $2.15 a day, that is coming from LSMS data and similar sorts of survey data. And Angus, in his work, and there's a direct quote here from his landmark textbook on analysis of household survey data, with improved measurement came improved analysis. His argument for creating LSMS was the World Bank is investing a massive amount in a project trying to end world poverty. That was its stated objective in the late 1990s when this project began. It can't do it unless it knows the current state of the world. Where are people poor? Where do they live? What are their characteristics? Is there a difference between female-headed households and male-headed households? Households with livestock keeping occupations versus crop production occupations versus working in factories versus being unemployed. A lot of these things may seem kind of obvious to you, but most of what you think is obvious is based off of facts established by these sorts of data. And so these data help to lay the foundation for improved analysis, improved policy making. Not that all of it goes well, not that all of it is correct. Science proceeds by making mistakes that get corrected, but it has enabled advance. The current generation of real advances are coming from high frequency data, high frequency longitudinal data in particular. And the real reasons for this are four. The first is living standards are dynamic. Think of your own circumstance. How many of you are rich right now? How many of you want to be rich at some point in the future? Okay, a few of you are honest and are raising your hands. This is showing measurement error, right? You know, that people don't tell you the truth in surveys. And how many of you predict you're going to be rich in the future? Interesting, it's not the same hands going up. That's typical too. But the point here is that your current state is not your aspirational nor your expected future state. You expect your living conditions to be dynamic. That's probably why you came to school. You think you will improve your prospects for a good career by getting education today, investing today for an improved future. That's telling us something about your dynamics. So if living standards are dynamic, we understand dynamics best by following the same units over time. Because otherwise you're making very imperfect comparisons between different people at different stages. And there's lots of stuff you don't observe, so you're going to conflate things you didn't observe that differ between them with a change due to things you do observe, like how old are they or how much education did they get. So if living standards are dynamic, one thing we really need to understand, especially if we're concerned about things like poverty or food security or ill health, is when people aren't doing well, when people are poor, is that a transitory, a temporary condition, or is that a permanent condition? Do we expect their poverty to persist for a long time unless we do something? Or do we expect that they're naturally going to come out of it? Does anybody have any idea what the half-life of an American household in poverty was at the turn of the millennium in 2000? How long from the moment a household in the United States became poor until half of them had exited poverty?
120 years.
120 years. It's a little high. Someone else want to guess? About 4 months. So a little bit less than 120 years. So 4 months was the median duration, median spell length, we call it, in poverty in the United States around the year 2000. We don't even know what the median duration in poverty is among a lot of the rural poor communities I work in Kenya and Ethiopia and Madagascar, because we haven't yet observed half of the households poor in our initial surveys exiting poverty. That's a huge difference in living conditions. Is it fun to be poor in the United States today? No, it's miserable. My family was on social assistance. I was a grad student with multiple children. We were on WIC. We were very poor. We couldn't afford to go out. My wife and I would go out on dates by having friends babysit our kids, and we'd go to the local bookstore where they had a Scrabble game, and we'd sit at a table and play Scrabble, drinking a cup of coffee each. That was our big splurge for a date. That was all we could afford. It wasn't fun, but we also knew we were going to get out of that. That was temporary because I was a grad student. But a lot of these communities face much longer periods in poverty if we don't do something to resolve the structural conditions that trap them there. And that's what makes a difference. There's no particular reason. I was on WIC because I had young children. I wasn't eligible for any assistance as an able-bodied adult. But you don't need to help me while I'm a student. I'm going to get out of this. But people who have no prospect of escaping without some sort of intervention, we have different set of policy tools for them. So the first and basic reason for high-frequency longitudinal survey data is to be able to distinguish between those who are temporarily or transitorily poor, where it's not always clear you actually want to intervene, because you can make mistakes. By the time you figure out somebody's temporarily poor and you try to intervene, you've often sort of missed the window. But people who are chronically poor in the absence of some intervention will, by definition, remain poor in expectation. So that distinction matters a lot for targeting interventions. The second reason to have longitudinal data collection is seasonality. It's not so much true for those of us who have permanent jobs, especially permanent jobs at salaries rather than hourly work that might vary over the season. But in rural communities, seasonality is huge. By the way, there are a whole bunch of seats down here for those who are standing in the back, if you would like. Seasonality matters for two reasons. One, if we want to make inferences around chronic and transitory conditions, if we keep going back to the same household once every year or once every several years at the same time of year, we will miss an awful lot of what happens in between. Look at these two graphics that come from Helen Keller International data from Bangladesh. The upper one shows you what you would conclude about child wasting, meaning children have very low weight for their height. If you just looked at the same time each year, you'd see that over this couple of year period, these observations look like there's a little bit of increase in the prevalence of child wasting, but not a lot. But the underlying data show a very different story, this fourfold fluctuation within years in child wasting prevalence. So if we want to be able to figure out interventions at moments where kids are really vulnerable, and I'm going to come back to real world applications of this in a minute, we need to be collecting data at higher frequency than just every few years. If we collect just at the same moment of time, we will miss that seasonality. If we collected frequently, but not at the same moment in time, we will conflate seasonal changes for permanent changes. So we'll have a lot of difficulty in really figuring out what's going on in these underlying dynamics. So understanding chronic versus transitory and controlling for seasonality are two of the big reasons. Those have existed for a long, long time. The things that have changed that are making high frequency longitudinal data much more valuable relate to risk and uncertainty. The world is simply getting riskier. We talk about polycrises, and I'll use that term a couple of slides from now. When there's risk, when there's uncertainty, when things are changing, first, people behave differently. When you're faced with uncertainty, you have to adjust your decision making. I was talking with a PhD student today who's thinking about where to go for postdoctoral employment. He's not a US permanent resident or citizen, and sudden changes in immigration law in the United States are changing his decision making about where to go next year relative to what a year and a half ago he would have predicted. That is, in the microcosm, a universal phenomenon. We all change our behaviors in response to perceived changes in risk exposure. If you don't study high frequency data, it's really hard to measure risk accurately. So as we start to appreciate that people are going to respond, they'll take defensive actions, applying for jobs abroad rather than in the United States, because you're not sure if anyone will sponsor an H-1B visa now. That's an example of a defensive action where wouldn't have applied for those jobs before, now definitely applying for those jobs. Forgive the technical speak here for some of you. It means moments beyond the mean, variance and skewness, the volatility in something suddenly matter a lot to behavior and well-being. And this is where I start to get very technical. So if this doesn't make sense, check out for a moment and come back in a couple slides. If most of our statistical inference is based on assumption of stationarity, it assumes that as we are going in and drawing data, we're drawing from a distribution that never changes. Do you really believe that? Do you believe that nothing has changed in the last 12 months? Or the last 12 years? Climate change means weather patterns for farmers are fundamentally different looking forward than they were 12 years ago, 15 years ago, when they were looking forward. A farmer who doesn't figure that out and adapt is someone who won't be a farmer for very long because they're just not going to make it. So non-stationarity matters to our inferences, to what we expect to happen, to what we think works, to how we describe reality. But we can't figure out whether the underlying distributions are changing unless we measure frequently to track that sort of change. This is going to matter for using modern tools of statistics, as I'll come to in a minute. And then the last point, which is, I'll just fast forward through because it's a little more technical. Improved inference, answering the question of what works. Seems a simple question. It's actually very hard to answer rigorously, but answering the question what works requires being able to control for a lot of confounders, a lot of things that happen in the background that we can't measure very well. Like the great confounder understanding what's the value of a Cornell education is what was going to happen to all of you if you didn't come here. We're never going to observe that because you're Cornell students. You chose to come here rather than whatever other college or university you were considering, or not going to college or university. Some of you may have even done better had you gone someplace else or not gone to college than you will do coming here, because you are so talented that we are just grabbing hold of your talent, putting a big red C on it, and claiming you as ours when you succeed later on. Some of you, I would like to believe, we're going to add value to. It's very hard to tease that out statistically if we don't observe people at multiple points in time. So we call this in econometrics, we call it fixed effects. Take care of the time invariant unobservables, somebody's sort of latent drive, their social and familial connections. There are also questions of internal and external validity that I'm happy to talk offline with grad students or faculty. Let me skip it since a lot of the audience is undergrads. We're in a polycrisis era, so this issue of risk and measuring more frequently is more valuable today than it used to be. It's more valuable because food prices have been going crazy. This is a plot of real, meaning inflation-adjusted food prices since January 1990 until August. So 2 months ago. Most people focus on the left side of this. Inflation-adjusted food prices around the world are up 50% since the 1990s. That's a lot. But the standard deviation, a measure of volatility, is up 150%. Volatility has increased even faster than the mean price has. You can see it in these big, this is the price spike I was mentioning before in 2007-8, another in 11-12, one right around the end of COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Same thing, number of recorded natural disaster events. Part of this is we measure better, and so there's more recordation of things that happened. We missed a lot back here. But nobody seriously believes that we aren't having more serious weather events than we had 100 years ago. So whether it's weather, whether it's prices, there's more conflict on the African continent today than there has been in my lifetime at any other moment. Whatever dimension you like to think about risk, it's happening. You know, you've just lived through a big pandemic. That was my first pandemic. I'm 61 years old. So in a polycrisis environment, it becomes hard to distinguish humanitarian assistance, saving lives, saving livelihoods in a moment of crisis, from the long-run development project. Because shocks are disruptive. They cause people to change their behaviors. People lose stuff. Houses get washed away. Livestock die of disease. Family members die of disease. And when you have lots of shocks, the disruption to the long-run development process can be huge. So disentangling these becomes increasingly hard, and that's why there's a lot of enthusiasm around this concept of resilience over the last, really it took off here. It took off in 2007-8. You started to see a huge increase in use of this term among policymakers. This especially matters for those who hover on the edge of being trapped in chronic poverty, what some of us call poverty traps. I'm not going to go into the weeds, especially on interpreting a graphic like this. This comes from a paper that my colleague Mark Constas and I published a number of years ago, where we advanced a theory of resilience as it applies to development. But the whole idea was that people can bounce around. They can suffer shocks in this non-poor zone, and it's not a problem. My son is a Navy doctor. He earns a very good income. In case you didn't notice, the government shut down last night. He's not going to get a paycheck until they start to get around to letting the government operate again. He's going to suffer a shock from that. But he's a doctor. He makes a decent income. He's got savings. He'll bounce back quickly. They will pay him back pay when they finally get around to reopening the US government. He's in this zone where he can suffer a bunch of fluctuations, but isn't going to get trapped. Others, my daughter who's a social worker, if she goes, she has no savings. If she goes without pay for an extended period, she's hurting. Like that, and then she picks up the phone and says, "Mom and Dad, I can't make rent. Can you help?" And we don't want her to be homeless. So we set a little safety net to let her bounce back. And then going back to my son, an emergency room doctor, his job is to keep bad shocks from killing people. If you believe in emergency rooms, you're fundamentally believing that there are what technically we call absorbing states. Points where, in the absence of an intervention, people die. And if you intervene, you can fundamentally change their future trajectory. If you don't believe in poverty traps, I've challenged a couple of my economist colleagues who are skeptical about poverty traps. I've asked them to sign a pledge to never go to an emergency room. Because intellectually, you're saying I don't need an emergency room either. So you're intellectually inconsistent to say there aren't poverty traps, but we need emergency rooms. So the whole idea of a world that's getting riskier, we need to measure things more frequently, in part so we can figure out where are people in this space. How do we help people not collapse into a state of permanent poverty or worse, perishing? How do we help people recover? One of the best books on this that I know of was written by a Cornell graduate student, Anirudh Krishna, now a political science professor at Duke, called One Illness Away. He does these surveys across the world, India, Uganda, Kenya, Peru, North Carolina. And the common denominator across the experience over many years of families was households that suffered some catastrophic health shock get cast into poverty from which they can't subsequently escape easily. That the single biggest common denominator to why people become poor was illness or injury, some big health shock. What's the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States? Medical bills. That's far and away the biggest reason why Americans declare bankruptcy, because they can't afford the cost of their medical care. So that's the sort of thing that casts people in the long run poverty. They go bankrupt. Those of you who are interested in research on this, a few of us edited a book on this 6 years ago. And my colleague Heather Schofield and I have a paper, a short conceptual paper on risk-based poverty traps out in review right now. So high frequency longitudinal survey data becomes especially important when we care about resilience, when there are all these shocks and we're worried that people can get thrust into long-run poverty or ill health or whatever it might be. Many times they go together. So the key here is a guy at IFPRI and I, Derek Hiddey, wrote this paper in 2015, so 10 years ago, calling for a multinational system of high-frequency longitudinal data collection sites. And this finally started to get through. It's starting to happen. The World Bank is now recasting the whole LSMS program around high-frequency data. So this is kind of breaking news. They're just starting to implement this. The problem is that's not what we've been doing. So people are trying to study resilience, but most studies, 224 studies, a group of us did an evidence synthesis on. Of those 224 studies, we could identify the claim to study resilience. Just 16% used any longitudinal data. So 84% had just one observation of people, yet they claim to describe what's happening over time to them. So doesn't make any sense. You can't really make any good inferences about that. And the vast majority of these were not high frequency. So we're still kind of flying blind on resilience programming. Let me skip through this slide. So one lure is skip surveys, just use satellites. How many of you have played with Earth observation remote sensing data? few of you. It's really cool stuff. I don't know about you. I get really jazzed by maps. I did as a kid, I still do. I find them very exciting. That's why I have a map up here. Although this is not a map I generated. This comes from this paper by Chris Ye and his colleagues, where they have this just mind-blowing statistic when you think about it very long, and this phenomenal graphic. They just look at all the consumption and wealth surveys in Africa and how long was it between them. And this map shows you that the really high frequency places, just 1 or 2 years between them, places like Egypt, Uganda, Zambia, that's 1 or 2 years. That's not high frequency. And how long is it before the average household gets revisited in a survey? In the United States, on average, each of us will get sampled once in our lives. In Africa, it's more than 10,000 years between survey revisits. You have to be exceptionally long-lived to get a second survey, unless it's meant to be longitudinal. So just the way we are presently operating, we're sort of not built to get longitudinal data. So the promise of satellite data, here you see the frequency of revisits per household by different satellite platforms, different remote sensing data streams we use right now. And when you get to the kind of the current generation, this actually is even more frequent now. This paper is 5 years old. The planet data, its revisit rate and its accuracy, 3-meter resolution, means you see every household on average daily. You can't figure out what's Christy eating for lunch. You have to ask her. You can't see that from space yet. But this is what excites people. We can suddenly get data at really high frequency, at really high resolution, so we can see sort of everybody all the time. And if you believe anything I've just said, that should be valuable. The problem is it's not. It's a siren song. It draws us in. We think we can do lots with it, and we can, but only if we have the survey data anchor it with. Because the things we care about, you can't see from space. You can't see if people are poor. You can't see if they're sick. You can't see if they're hungry. You can come up with some proxies that we think correlate with that, but you can't really do it. Machine learning models that use this huge ocean of data coming at us now can do lots of good prediction, but only when we have good training data. Without good training data for these models, they don't do well. And that non-stationarity problem that I described before, like climate change, poses real problems here. Because if I'm trying to train a model on 5-year-old data, but the world has changed since then, it's not going to predict particularly well. So we have a lot of examples of that. Let me skip this. And we don't do very well in the places we don't observe very often or frequently. So where we don't collect survey data, like in places prone to conflict, as data collectors, I manage teams that go collect data. I can't responsibly say, please go off to this village where there's active conflict and ask people questions. And by the way, keep your head down. I was horrified years ago. I've done long-term work in southern Ethiopia. Years ago, we'd had a session with all of our enumerator teams across this area of southern Ethiopia. And we went to drop a couple of them off at their work sites, their villages. And when we get to one of them in Karate, the enumerator hops out and one of his buddies comes out and hands him an AK-47 and a bandolier of bullets. And he's got, this is back in paper questionnaire days, he's got a stack of questionnaires under his arm and an AK-47 in the other hand. And I'm going, oh my God, what am I doing to this poor guy? There are deep ethical questions about collecting data in conflict zones. But if we don't collect data in conflict zones and we try to predict what's going on there off of data in places that have no conflict, you shouldn't be surprised we get it wrong a lot of the time. It's like the same problems we have with pharma trials run on one population, but then you try to use those to figure out what works for a different population. Drugs only trialed on men that are given to women, pregnant women. Lots of things can go wrong. We have the analog here with data use, where we don't collect good data. Let me skip reproducibility and that. So this can work, though. Liz Tennant, who's sitting in the back, has led a really exciting effort using high-frequency data that our colleague Joanna Upton's been leading the collection of in Malawi for a number of years. And the World Bank was interested in, can you use those data and Earth observation data, that's what EO means, to nowcast, to predict what's the current state. We aren't asking people right now, but given we asked them just a few months ago what were things like, and we can see how green the Earth is right now, we can see how much precipitation has fallen, can we predict their current food security status, FCS, food consumption score, or household hunger score? Could we even predict whether kids drop out of school? The answer is we can do really well on some things. Food security, we can nowcast really well, actually, very high rates of accuracy. Can't do it very well at all for dropouts from school or even illness for kids. This is just telling you kind of different algorithms for doing it. Ignore that. We're doing this in Kenya with the National Drought Monitoring Authority, where they have for years been going out and taking the mid-upper arm circumference of kids, a very good predictor of wasting, of acute malnutrition among kids. And what we found is if you use those data to train machine learning models in Earth observation, you can generate quite good forecasts, actually. So that 9 months out, I can predict at ward level, where is there likely to be a high prevalence of child acute malnutrition 9 months later. Each of these polygons is a ward. Red means higher than 15% prevalence. This is the same prediction 6 months later. So these communities, which we thought might be at risk, are no longer at risk, but these two continue to seem at risk. And when we look at the actual realizations, they were spot on. We got every single ward in the country right. This is the sort of thing you can act on if you're a government. If you know 6 months out where there are going to be a lot of kids who are suddenly hungry so that we can get relief food in there, if you give a government, a responsible government, 6 months notice, they can act. If we just do this off survey data, you can tell them a year ago you had this many malnourished kids in this place. You can't do anything about children a year ago. There are other nice features about these types of models. They actually work best when you most need them to work. They don't always work well, but they work really well when things are rough. And let me actually fast forward. Yeah. We're on the cusp of setting up anticipatory financing. So these models, the Kenyan government is going to later this year start making cash transfers on the basis of these predictions, which we'll be able to then evaluate when we, for those who understand the language, when we use synthetic controls, we use a blend of all the other places. Do we measurably change the arc of malnutrition in those places by getting mobile money into their mothers' phones when we can start to predict that a lot of those kids are going to be in trouble if their families don't do something? We can also use high-frequency data to do things like design drought contracts. So a group of us 15 years ago now, one of Ed's best friends ran this program, a brilliant Kenyan PhD from Cornell named Andrew Mude. We developed something called index-based livestock insurance. Loss of herds is the main source of collapse into poverty in dry lands in Kenya and Ethiopia. Those places I was telling you, like the AK-47, that's the dry lands of southern Ethiopia. That's right there. We use these high-frequency longitudinal data to design a financial contract, literally a European put option for those of you who know derivatives, a put option on greenness on the rangelands, because we found it predicted really well herd mortality rates. If the grass goes brown, animals don't do as well. They get thinner, they lose weight, they don't calve. If they calve, they don't lactate. Bad stuff happens. We could use the high-frequency longitudinal data and the satellite data streams over 30 years to price that risk and turn it into an insurance contract that commercial reinsurers would underwrite. So we could take drought risk from East Africa and push it into European capital markets. So that's what we did across these pilot areas in 2010. We launched the same thing in southern Ethiopia in 2012. It's all written up in this open access book if anyone's interested. This is now scaling out across Somalia, the rest of Kenya and Ethiopia, Djibouti. Products exist in Zambia. It underwrites sovereign drought insurance in Mauritania. This is all because of high frequency longitudinal data. Use these data, you can design products that can help solve people's problems. I just mentioned this where we're trying to do anticipatory cash transfers. Yeah, sorry. So let me stop there. I'm past time where you wanted to end. So I'm happy to take questions or comments. Tell me I'm crazy.
Perfect timing. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A discussion. So if you can make your question, if you introduce yourself, let's start right here. And please we take one question at a time so you can respond to it. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Hello, thank you for your presentation. My name is Irene. I'm from the Brooks School. I'm a master's in public administration student. I was curious because you were providing examples of graphs for what dictates a non-high frequency versus a high frequency, but I was a bit curious as to how frequent data collection has to be to actually be considered high frequency longitudinal data. Is it several times in a month? To what point? To what end? I just didn't get that part.
You don't have a good answer.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Clearly, frequency is not every second or third. Go back, think about that. Africa, way back when. Right now we are doing well when we get every few years, we go back and run a nationally representative survey. Not the same household, just we run a survey every few years. And if they're really careful, they try to go back to the same households. That's not high frequency. I think the emerging consensus, although I'm speculating, is high frequency is at least quarterly, at least every 3 months. But there isn't a good definition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think it really opened up our minds to a lot of new things happening. My also very curious question is, what kinds of training data do you need to let these systems reliably measure like malnutrition, for example? I'm just curious to know what kinds of training data are needed.
The short answer is a lot. These are very hungry models. Machine learning models are, forgive the technical, they're non-parametric models. So if we don't assume a lot of structure to the process, you need a lot of data to figure out exactly what's going on. So for example, that early warning system I talked about that we're now about to use for anticipatory cash transfers, we trained that on about 3 million observations of children's mid-upper arm circumference. And that's sort of borderline enough. You need a lot of data for that sort of thing. In the work Liz led that I showed you from Malawi, we have far less data than that, but we're not trying to predict things at quite the same resolution. But you still need big samples, like tens of thousands of observation at an absolute minimum. And more is much better, but more is costly.
I was wondering about seasonality. That you have the graph there. Like for certain countries, it would be like too expensive to actually have like these instruments to run like every quarterly, maybe yearly. What will be like the options, for example, to get like a better picture of that? You were talking to interventions or for helping development.
Low frequency. The data Liz and team were using from Malawi is monthly. Malawi is a very poor country. They have a very light survey instrument collected by a resident in the village, so you're not paying lots of transport, you're not paying high capital city salaries. There are ways to make this work without overburdening either the the fiscal authority for something super expensive or overburdening survey respondents that I don't want to talk to you for 3 hours once a month. It can be done.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Unique Mackey. I'm an MPS student in Global Development Department. Thank you so much for being here today. And this might be an extension of what you were hinting at the end of that statement there. But I was curious about this theory of resilience and whether or not your resilience and like the living standards that you have could be used to like supplement some of the survey data that you need to like make the technology that you're talking about, right?
Can you elaborate a little bit? Not 100% sure I'm following.
Yeah. So like you talked about like the theory of resilience and how like it's rooted in like living standards and risk aversions and whatnot. So with like this again, this model evaluates the some of the
Yeah.
Now, resilience measurement is heavily contested. Workspace, all of us pointy-headed wonks. You don't, yeah, to be clear. I have strong opinions on it, but that doesn't mean that they're widely accepted. Means I hold those opinions. In terms of what those measures are, and yeah, just like we right now test, I was on because I satisfied very specific measurable criteria. I had children certain ages, had income a certain threshold, had asset holdings below a certain threshold, I was eligible. And then they would measure my children. We'd bring them in and they take blood and see what their iron levels are, and they check their weight and their height and all that sort of stuff. In principle, you can do that with other forms of measurement to try to build resilience among a population you think is vulnerable. And that's precisely where some of us are trying to head. We're still quite a long ways from that point.
I have a question as well. I'm not using my mic as a feedback. So you speak of a lot of remote sense data, but we also know there's a lot of data being generated as more and more systems are digitized and more people are using mobile phones. Would you speak more of that type of data that's being generated from people using more digital means that are generating data?
Yeah, so call data records, as we refer to them, are another source of remotely sensed data, because every time you turn on your phone and it connects to a tower, it's registering your location. And so as long as we know a unique identity of that phone, we can track where it goes when from every time it pings a tower. And we use those data. We use those here in the US. My colleague David Just in the Dyson School has been using those to try to figure out optimal locations for food pantries in the southern tier. Because if we know particular communities have very high concentrations of food insecure people, and we can track where they go with their phones, you can figure out what routes along which are probably a lot of food insecure people traveling who are underserved right now, and you can locate them optimally. We can do similar things in the developing world. Indeed, the COVID response in Togo was designed by colleagues at UC Berkeley using call data records, where they figured out from call data records who's likely poor, and then they could push money out onto those phones. Those are also rich records. Mm-hmm. The main problem with call data records in very poor places, especially very poor rural places, is phone ownership and cell coverage. A lot of where I work in northern Kenya, as Ed knows, he's been up there, there's no cell reception and people are too poor to own even a really basic phone. So you're going to miss all of those people.
Is there any questions from online audience? If not, I'll give the last voice to Benga. You had one more question?
Yes.
I'll ask you to just shout it out if there's no online questions.
Yeah, sure. This came up while you were answering Ed's question, but it's about the privacy issues that like ethics around using these kinds of data, especially since we have tested them in some forest parts of.
Great question. There are big ethics around data, as we're all starting to appreciate. It's around who we don't collect data from, but we make inferences and we subject them to things trained on other people's data that might not fit them. That example of drugs used on pregnant women, never tested on a pregnant woman, voluntarily at least. That's just dangerous. There's a lot of ethical problems with that. We have the same thing with data. If you don't collect data on people, it's a problem. But if you do collect data on people, it can be a problem too. You have to be very careful about de-identification so that as data are made available, you restrict who has access to data that you could identify with individuals. And when you do start to release data publicly, you aggregate it so people can't reverse engineer to figure out, oh, this is his call. The problem is when those collecting the data have incentives that run against that. Those of us in the research community are usually pretty good about de-identifying data and safeguarding privacy in individually identifiable information. But if I'm a social media provider and people will pay me to help them target ads, my incentives run against de-identification. That's where we have the problem. Is how do we set up protections that let us harness the power of high-frequency data, high-frequency longitudinal data, that especially that gets really down to individual level, and yet create some barrier to people's nefarious use of that data, where they're just manipulating you. My wife was commenting this morning as she's scrolling through an article, and our dog had peed on the rug the day before, and up pops an ad for urine buster in your carpet. This freaked her out because, she hadn't searched for it. We were just talking and she's like, how does my phone know that I was looking for this? We should all be freaked out.
Thank you, Chris. Please help me. By the way,